the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of being too focused on things like rankings and ratings, whether that be UTR or WTN or, I think for a lot of league players, checking maybe checking NTRP or checking players' results online. But the impact of checking, ratings and results and focusing too much on, rankings, ratings, and results rather than, some alternatives, rather than focusing a little bit more on your game, rather than, focusing a little bit more on the process. And actually the idea for this came from an interesting place. So I play a good amount of chess and was watching a video from a popular YouTuber. His name is his username is Gotham Chess, and plays at a very high level, and was talking about how when he plays, he has installed a Chrome extension on his computer so that when he's playing, he doesn't see his opponent's ELO. And ELO is essentially a rating, right? It says at this moment, what is my opponent rated? And so he doesn't see his opponent's ELO or their name. And it got me thinking that, in tennis, right? Yes, maybe you cannot look at the draw in a tournament or not look at the UTR website or look online, but it's tough to do that. We generally know or look up on our own the ratings and rankings of the person that we're playing, and that can have quite an impact. So I think we could talk more about the impact that that has, and then some alternatives and some potential different directions that players can go in rather than focusing too much on the results and on their own results and on the results of their opponents.
And I think that this is a phenomenon that is a little bit more recent, Josh, right? I mean, UTR probably has made it in tennis more obvious. I feel like UTR has been around maybe about 10, 11 years. So maybe we're kind of on our second generation of players who are going through it, maybe third generation of players who are going through it. And NTRP has obviously been out there longer, but NTRP, because you're not seeing the dynamic calculation day to day, week to week, it's a little bit more of a black box about your number, and you're pretty much stuck with your number the whole year.
Yep.
It feels like that doesn't affect players in the exact same way that a dynamic rating does. So we see probably more discussion of UTR amongst our younger players, whether they be in the 12s all the way to the 18s. There's some concern with it, I think, in college tennis, but less. And there are a lot of challenges around it because it's very easy to tie your image as a player to a particular number. And the tough part about that number is that it's not fully within your control. There are so many variables that go into it. Although the number often will claim to be 100% reliable, I think that it's hard to say that it is, Josh, because it assumes in every match that you're at full energy, that you're not injured. Right? It doesn't understand. There's no sort of compensation for the fact that this is your second or third match of the day. There's no compensation for that. You might have tweaked, something in your leg or arm, but you decided to go play anyway. And that's on both sides of the court. So it's very tough to deal with this number and see it. And I think one of the hardest parts for younger players is everybody knows what it is. Nearly everybody has the app and they can see it. And if you're training in a group, inevitably someone in the group is going to be obsessed with UTR and talking about it and telling you, oh yeah, that guy you're playing in the first round, he's a so-and-so and you should beat him or her. kind of thing.
Should.
Should be,
Yeah.
right? Should being the tough word there. And so much focus goes into this number, not only because of the self image, but if you're a young player who wants to play college tennis, whether we like it or not, it's a factor. Most coaches will use that number to decide if I'm going to email you back or not, or get in touch with you in the first place. So
Mhm.
it's pretty brutal in that regard. So I like the chess story. It's a little bit more of a controlled environment, which is great. You can put that Chrome extension in, and as you said, he's a higher level player. So it'd be interesting to ask him, why exactly did you do that? What impacts did you notice on your playing against somebody who is rated lower, maybe right at the same level, or maybe a little bit better? We see those scenarios all the time in tennis, but I'd really be curious to hear that from someone in a different performance context.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And one thing that actually the video that brought it to my attention, he's for people that are familiar with how chess ratings work. So he's an international master, which is the level below grandmaster. So he was actually facing a grandmaster, and I think one of the top rated players in the world, like maybe one of the top 20 players. And so he was playing the game. He ended up winning. And then afterwards, he sees, okay, you won and you beat this guy who's, one of the top players. So it's, I think even for somebody like him who's, playing at a very elite level, easy to get in your head, right?
Yeah,
It's
locker
almost the
room power,
equivalent of
right? Even in the
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. Almost the equivalent of maybe let's say a challenger level player who's maybe, ranked, I don't know, 150 in the world, something like that, playing against somebody ranked 20 or 30 in the world, right? It's very easy to get in your head about that. And it's interesting with UTR, and I think we talked about NTRP, and some I've also seen adult players that I work with who will look at tennis record, and you can see sort of a dynamic and NTRP a little bit. It's similar to that. Not giving people not trying to give people another resource to fixate on, but I know I think if we're talking about UTR, which is widely used, and obviously USTA and a lot of national federations now are moving to WTN, but there's still a lot of talk about UTR. Um, I think what ends up happening is players identify a lot with their UTR, and they feel, okay, my UTR is this, and then that is my level right now. And I think there's a lot of players who feel that their UTR doesn't reflect their abilities or their level, and that's fair, and that often can be the case. But I think a couple of ways that we can poke holes at that, or maybe help a player to see that their UTR isn't exactly reflective of where they are. And then it really is just an algorithm, right? It really is just an algorithm, a formula where it just looks at results. Did you win? Did you lose? Against who? Against who? And what's their UTR? And what was the score? And, a player cannot play for a month. And guess what? Their UTR can go up and go down during that time. You can be at an all-time high UTR after a month or 3 months of not playing any matches, any tournaments. Now, does that mean that you're better than you were a month or 3 months ago? Not necessarily, but just based on the way the algorithm works, based on maybe the way that your opponents did in matches, their results, your UTR can shoot up or can really rise or really drop. You can also win a tournament, win multiple matches, win a tournament, and your UTR can drop. So I think that we want to find ways to help players, not think too much about UTR, not identify too much about their UTR or their ratings and results. Understand what it is. It's a resource online. It's a algorithm. It can be a tool. Again, you mentioned the recruiting process. Um, so that really is what it is, and it has certain uses, but not making sure that people aren't letting it letting it completely go overboard. And I think that happens a lot. You mentioned Dead Eddie, at different tennis clubs or different clinics, that inevitably there's going to be somebody talking about it. And a lot of coaches will talk about it. And, and parents talk about it and players talk about it with each other. And it really at this point is a, culturally is something that's widely discussed. But I think, if you ask a lot of people, if you ask most players, does checking your UTR, does checking your opponent's UTR, does that actually help you? Or why are you doing it? I think a lot of players will recognize that it doesn't. It tends to add a lot of pressure. It tends to cause them to maybe, fear losing or fear what could happen if you lose to a lower rated player. But then people will say, "Oh, well, I'm just curious. I'm just curious about who I'm playing, or I want to be prepared for that match." So I think we can talk a little bit about sort of the impact of that, but I think it's important that we're discussing it because it's just so widely discussed. It's so widely talked about in tennis circles, especially among junior players. But I think among other types of players as well, whether it be adults or college, I definitely saw it discussed there as well.
I think it's important to do your best to put something like UTR into perspective so that it doesn't become a barrier to learning, improvement, and enjoying the game, because it can really have a negative impact. I got a call a couple days ago, Josh, from a mom who was crying about how her son is struggling with tennis, doesn't enjoy tennis anymore, is really showing his frustration not only on the court but at home, all because his UTR has gone down so much in the past few months, and that he can't seem to get any wins. And to me, that's not a very good story here. But ultimately, it's how can we reframe what UTR is, what it is trying to do, and how we can best use it. Because ultimately, it's something that is not within our control. And we talk about when we have some negative emotions, whether they're on the court or off the court, maybe unproductive emotions, they're often because we are assigning too much value to something that actually isn't that important. And so this is a clear sign, like the story is that this player is assigning too much importance to UTR, such that it is blocking his ability to focus on the things that are important to his growth as a player. And that's not to say that UTR isn't important at a certain level. But, there are players like my age, we didn't have UTR as a kid. It certainly made it easier in some ways. There were still rankings, or even as an adult. So, I didn't have this particular distraction, but we were still able to become really great players, whether we had UTR or not. So, okay, UTR could help in some ways, but it also isn't really necessary for a player's growth to know exactly where you are. I think the idea of just sort of trying to delete the app, never looking at it, never talking about it, is a good short-term strategy for many. It's a good short-term strategy to talk to one's parents or other training partners, and let's just not discuss that number. Ultimately, if we focus on doing our job of going out there and playing our identity, our A game, regardless of who the opponent is, better, same, worse, the UTR will take care of itself.
Mm-hmm.
But it's almost like by trying to make it go up, you almost inevitably sabotage yourself through that process. And as we've discussed many times, Josh, from a philosophical perspective, when you're paying so much attention to your current UTR, you're trying to prove yourself versus improve yourself. The most important version of who you are as a player is who you're becoming. But you're investing so much into who you are and proving that you're a good player that your game will just naturally plateau. The enjoyment will naturally go away because you're going to become frustrated over this thing you can't fully control. And it's a very hard thing, hard to talk to players and parents about what they're experiencing with this number. Some players obviously keep it in very good perspective, but some really struggle with it. And the idea is, okay, can we try to put it aside and bring it back to what you can actually control? What is important right now? And really just try to work through that. You work through routines on the court, work through your game plan, sort of like Dominic Arbati. Let's focus more on writing your game plan than worrying about a rating. Of course, we all don't want to lose. That's a natural, cognitive bias we have, right? Loss aversion. And that ends up, in fear. And we don't want to play through fear. That's never going to be our way to the top. But if we can recognize that, if we can get through that by playing a little bit more courageously toward the player we want to become, then we give ourselves a chance of improving, of learning, of enjoying what we're doing. And then we don't have to worry about UTR. UTR will naturally go where it's going to go for us. So I just want to recognize this is really hard. And it can be hard for adults. I mean, there are some adults who pay attention to it as well. And there's less on the line for them in terms of the number because they're not being recruited for a team based on the number. But there can certainly be self-image concerns with it. And I think we also had another episode about performance identity versus purpose-based identity. And I think that's a lot of what is going on with something like UTR. I think, if we look at the rating systems, Josh, to me, UTR is probably the more problematic one, only in that WTN is counterintuitive. It goes backwards, right? We typically associate good performance with higher numbers, which is the reverse of WTN. It's almost like you go to a movie, Josh, oh, this is a great movie. That's a 1 out of 5. And you're like, that's not really how it works, So I feel like players are kind of struggling, like what WTN is really doing.
Especially since they've gotten used to the UTR system first.
Absolutely, right? It was definitely first on the map, and why WTN even exists is a question mark. It's not really solving any problem that wasn't there, that UTR wasn't trying to address, right? It's probably more political. But to me, UTR is still the number, even though the ITA has adopted WTN, USTA, ITF. I never hear anybody tell me they're worried about their WTN. Mm-hmm. It's always UTR. And I think it was started with good intentions. I think there were some real idealists around it. They wanted to democratize tennis, to make it less about age, less about gender, and more about ability and sharing experiences across age groups and genders. And that all sounds wonderful. But, at a certain level, it doesn't make as much sense. And I think one thing that they didn't take into account is this natural bias that we have around loss aversion. They thought it would promote competition because people would want to improve the number. But in many regards, it hasn't. It has discouraged competition. Here in New England, where I live, we now have an initiative called Play to Completion, which means that we are requiring players to fulfill their obligations of playing through the main draw and the back draw, unless they get injured and they have to, submit paperwork for that. But so many players have pulled out of matches because there's a potential consequence to their rating. And they don't want to play this person because it could have a negative effect. So what do? They withdraw, and then the other person is left with no match. Mm-hmm. Or they've driven maybe a couple hours to get to this site only to realize nobody's coming to play them because somebody pulled out. That has been much more the case with UTR than encouraging people to play more matches. So, I mean, to me, this has been a bit of a long monologue here, but I think we've got to all figure out how to put it in perspective so that it doesn't detract from our enjoyment of the game and learning and improving to become that player you could become. We don't know how good you could become. That's really, it's going to be up to you and how much work you put into it. But that potential is unknown. But if you're focusing on things you can't control, like UTR, there will probably be some regrets in the future about how you did this.
I think definitely because I think it puts so much, it puts pressure on us because if we're looking at our opponent's UTRs, right? Okay, I'm playing somebody in their zero point 0.3 above me or their zero point 0.2, zero point 0.3 below me. It's really easy for those, for just that number to lead to expectations. Okay, somebody's above me. That means I assume that they're really good, that I can't beat them, that I'm going to have to play perfectly to even have a chance. And that's not true, right? And the same goes in reverse that, okay, I'm looking at my opponent's UTR and it's lower, and that means I should win. And again, that word should comes up, or I'm supposed to win. Or, and players will just even mention it casually, like, and I try to check them on it when they do it. They're like, oh, I was playing somebody who's above me or, below me, or, somebody I was supposed to beat. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean you're supposed to beat them? Um, and I think players recognize that that's not true, right? Maybe they're watching the Grand Slam tournaments and they see all the upsets, right? There's a draw full of upsets, right? Yes, there's oftentimes the higher ranked or rated player wins, but there's you know uh, upsets every single day. And they recognize that. They recognize that lower ranked and rated players beat higher ones all the time, yet they still think that because their UTR is above somebody's, that they are supposed to win or should win. And that they could be simply echoing the words of other people. Could be their parents, could be their coaches, could be their siblings, could be other players at the tennis club or wherever they train. But I think it's just important that we can take a step back and zoom out and understand that again, what UTR is. It's just a formula. It's just sort of a measure of results, and it doesn't actually reflect where somebody is, right? As you said, Brian, it doesn't recognize if somebody's played their second or third match of a day. Doesn't recognize if somebody's injured. Let's say somebody's just come back from an injury, but their UTR is what it is. It might not actually reflect where they're at. Let's say somebody's been working on their game a lot, working on their physical game, their mental game, and they've taken strides. The UTR website doesn't know that. So, again, it's just that measurement of those results and the results of your opponents. So I think if we can recognize that it's really not who we are, it's just simply a formula that about results, then we can move towards that, a better form of identity where it's not so result driven. It really is more about us working on, being the best player that we can be, really trying to prioritize excellence and improvement rather than it being all about results. And we've talked about this in the past, but if it's too much about results, if that's what we're prioritizing, if that's what we're thinking about, that's not a stable or sustainable way to be viewing our identity because nobody wins all the time. Nobody's UTR goes up endlessly every week, right? If it did, then you would eventually have the world's highest UTR, right? And currently that belongs to Yannick Sinner. But if we're being realistic, it's going to go up, it's going to go down. Hopefully it trends up, right? But checking it too much, focusing on it too much, having these expectations for our matches that we're going to win or lose simply based on that is not fair and is not sustainable. And I think, there is a place for it. I think we can look at our UTR maybe every 6 months and say, okay, well, I'm here now. And then where was I 6 months ago? And where was I a year ago? And it can be a measurement to say, okay, am I trending in the right direction? Am I moving in the direction I want to be moving in? But looking at it weekly, looking at it every day, as some players do, is simply counterproductive.
And you're only torturing yourself, and you're letting your feelings about yourself as a tennis player be driven by an algorithm that sits on some computer somewhere in California, probably. So, but the hard part, Josh, is it's not going away.
Yep.
So we have to put it into context. And I think we, generically, what I would give as an exercise to players is to, and I think maybe we've talked about the idea of a circle exercise, right? It's drawing a circle, putting everything you can fully control inside that circle, things that are outside your control, whether they be you have some influence or not, like weather, no influence, UTR, some influence, right? Putting all those outside and start to see, okay, when I think about my tennis game, what am I valuing more so than other things? Am I putting too much value and importance on something that's outside the circle? Do I have an opportunity to maybe shift more inside the circle? Knowing that, my belief is with this circle exercise is like the more you focus on the things you can control, the better chance you give yourself of achieving positive outcomes outside that circle that you want to achieve. And it's a little bit of a leap of faith. You have to practice that. But the first part is to examine, maybe take inventory of what you're valuing in tennis as part of your experience. And if you find that you're putting too much value on winning, too much value on UTR or ranking or playing well, or in the case of some other players, is a little bit different topic, but maybe putting too much value in the last point, too much value in being perfect. These give you opportunities to just understand yourself a little bit more. And then, all right, how can I put value into what's actually important, the things that I can fully control? Yep. And one that we've talked about a lot, Josh, is you playing your game, your A game, your competitive identity, treating that like a skill in itself, because UTR tends to trick us out of playing our A game. We might play not to lose. Or against a better opponent, we might say, we got to do more. These are all traps that get you to make bad decisions and where you don't practice playing your best tennis that's going to help you in the longer term. So that would be my first suggestion, Josh, is like, let's do an inventory of what you actually are putting most importance on in your tennis. Is it in your control or not? For sure, there'll be some things that are inside your circle that you are valuing. But can you start to look at the things that are outside that you don't fully control and lower the importance of them? Because you may have influence on them, but your influence is not so much that you want to decrease your performance on things you can't control.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's this idea of, controlling the controllables and the circle of control exercise. I think this idea obviously has been around for a long time, right? This idea of controlling the controllables is originally, from Stoicism, roughly 2,000 years ago. People were talking about it. And I think being able to apply it to sport and able to apply it to tennis really makes sense, because there's always going to be things out of our control. You mentioned weather, or you can't control your opponent, right? And maybe you can impact in certain ways how they play. Can't control how they act, can't control their playing style. People talk about their opponents pushing or playing in styles that they maybe don't like playing against. And, the fans, the courts, things like that. Also can't control the past and the future. So I think being really clear, crystal clear about what are some of those things that I can't control at all. And then, okay, what are some of those things that I can impact, but I can't fully control? And UTR would definitely fall into that category. But just understanding that, just by us focusing on winning more and focusing on UTR more and focusing on sort of the result and outcome piece, doesn't actually get us any closer to achieving those results and outcomes and wins that we want. What helps us get there is that process piece, right? Whether it's our attitude, whether it's our effort, whether it's our self-talk, whether it's how we use our tools or how we prepare, how we sleep, how we eat, hydrate, whatever it may be, the more we can focus on that side of things, the controllable side and the process side, the better chance we have for the result side. And if you can manage all those pieces on the controllable side, on your process side, does that guarantee results? No, but it gives you the best possible chance to have the types of results that you want. And what do you know when when you set yourself up for success with how you play and have in the results that you want, your UTR will improve. So rather than just focusing on it, focusing on how we get there and the process required to get there is really the pathway towards the types of improvements and successes that a player is looking for. And I think, when players can really adopt this mindset and this sort of perspective shift, it tends to really reduce their pressure, right? I mean, there's always going to be some pressure, but I think a lot of players end up putting unnecessary pressure on themselves. And when a player can really buy into this idea of as much as those things out of our control might be annoying or frustrating, that we want to be able to accept those things because there's nothing we can do about them and shift our focus towards those controllable factors that ultimately lead to the results and outcomes that we want. They tend to, experience less pressure and have more clear-cut things to focus on that directly lead to their improvement and to the outcomes that they desire. So I think it's a simple concept in a lot of ways, and it's a concept I know we've talked about, but I think it's something that deserves being talked about, repetitively in a certain way and reinforced because it constantly comes up. It's so easy to focus on these uncontrollable factors, and I think for a lot of players, it's their default state, right? Focusing on results, checking UTR, going into matches, saying things like I should win, I need to win, I'm supposed to win, and accidentally putting this unnecessary pressure on themselves and actually making it harder for them to perform well and making it more likely that they're going to play tight and probably play in a different style than the playing style that they play best, right? Than their sort of playing identity, but more so play maybe not to lose or fall into that loss aversion trap and back away from that way that they want to play in favor of trying to avoid losing and avoid again their UTR and results dropping.
And I think it keeps coming up, Josh, because our society emphasizes results, similar to like school, emphasizes grades over learning. We
Yep.
emphasize winning over learning.
Yep.
And, if there's one thing that we know, many players, or even like Mark Twain has said something to this effect, like when you start agreeing with the masses, it's time to like examine your position. And I would say that the majority of people, players, parents, coaches, don't really have the right perspectives on competition and what its purpose is. When you hear higher level players speak, you hear about people who get the fact that this isn't about just winning. This is about learning, figuring things out, right? I love the video from Kobe Bryant where he talks about how failure doesn't exist. And he says, he never plays out of a fear of losing or a need to win. He's always playing to figure things out, to learn something so that he can be better and better and better. Because what he gets is that when you make this all about learning and education, the results will come. If you make this all about winning, your potential to be a great player is much lower. You'll enjoy things less, eventually maybe even get bored or not happy with yourself. So this is all kind of a mindset shift that we have to learn to make. Otherwise, UTR, like many of the other things that are out of our control, just becomes another barrier that we have to deal with. And we don't want it to be something that we didn't deal with as well as we could have in the end, right? So good discussion, Josh. I know we have touched on these things in the past, but I think maybe setting a little bit more importance around the number itself and some of the things that we have seen in working with clients. Hopefully that's been beneficial for people to hear. So that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback for the two of us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. And you can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.